If you saw my last video, you'll know that in the early 2000s, Coronation Street suffered one of its most brutal humiliations when its attempt to bring back street icon, Bet Lynch, ended in disaster. But this is not the only time an icon's return has ended in embarrassment. On the 29th of September 2003, Dirty Den Watts returned to EastEnders, 14 years after being presumed dead, to a mixed reception. It's a story that has, at its heart, two great misconceptions. First, that Den's return was a shameless move to bolster ratings and required writers to ignore previously established canon, and secondly, that the storyline was of a poor quality. It's a brief window seen by many as the moment British soap jumped the shark, with comparisons inevitably being drawn between it and Dallas's infamous It Was All a Dream Bobby Ewing shower scene, where the show retconned a poorly received season by establishing everything that followed it was a strange dream, including the death of fan favourite Bobby Ewing. If anything, Dirty Den's return has become a core part of his legacy. It's impossible to discuss the character without talking about his seemingly miraculous return from the dead.
Listen to me, Den Watts. I don't care if you have come back from the grave. Get out of my pub! The only spirits I'm serving in this place are gin, whiskey and vodka. So you heard me. Get out!
What time's the EastEnders special?
Oh, I don't know. We stopped watching it, didn't we, Bren?
We did. I used to love it. But when they brought Dirty Den back, that was the final straw for me. I mean, nobody could survive that canal, especially with a bullet wound. I felt they were taking the mick-mick.
In this video, I want to dispel these two myths. We'll look at Den's initial time on the show, his first death, why he returned when he did, the storylines he got when he came back, and the controversy that brought it all crashing down.
23 Albert Square, Walford. I'm Den Watts, publican of Queen Victoria.
Jack and Pearl are not criminals. They're not angels either. Villains, perhaps? Well, he certainly is. They've been married for 15 years and haven't had sex with each other for 13 of them. The marriage is a front for the sake of the pub's image. The daughter, Tracy, is adopted, maybe for the same reason. They have a dog too, Prince, an Alsatian. Even with the marriage on the rocks, Jack still likes the area. His mates are here, it's friendly and it's his territory. Local lad makes good. People look up to him. If you've dragged yourself up by the scruff of the neck and moved up a notch, you need a few people around you who didn't quite make it, or you might as well be invisible. He's had a mistress for 5 years. Unlike Pearl, she's a very upmarket woman, a lady, real class. Jack's a bit of rough and they're happy. They actually talk. With Pearl, you shout or shut up. He's a smart dresser, changes his shirt twice a day and his shoes sparkle. He runs a good pub. He's firm and fair with the staff. If you've got any problems, go to him, not her. The cellars are well organised and spotless. His masculinity is the key to his character. It was called into question at an early stage in his marriage and he's defended it ever since. Some call him a ladies' man because of his good looks. Others, a man's man. He's a con man and has the gift of the gab. He can defend himself smartly in a brawl. He's only ever thumped Pearlie once. You can accept Jack being a snob because it's not malicious. It's done with a grin. Like Pearl, he's also trapped by his background. Jack and Pearl's relationship is pretty heated. The smooth public face, workers in pubs are always on stage, the trial reconciliations, the rows, the fights and the tears. Will Jack ever bring his mistress into the pub, which is Pearl's territory? Will Pearl accept too many free drinks from punters and lose control in public? They were lovers. They are husband and wife. There was affection, love if it came to it. Could they give each other up? Did the private grins and winks to each other when they're working as a team, which usually means taking money? The love turned to hatred. Jack the lad and the artificial Pearl, they're an electric couple. Such is the way EastEnders creators Tony Holland and Julia Smith described Dirty Den Watts, then called Jack, in their initial notes for the character. Aside from the names, little changed. Den was called Jack, his wife, Angie, was Pearl, and their daughter, Sharon, was Tracy. Conceived as being the landlord of the Queen Vic pub, the central hub for all the characters, it was vital that the actor cast as Den have the right sort of charisma, able to hold his own as one of the new soap's lead figures. Leslie Grantham was an unknown at the time, having a little stage experience under his belt, and whose most famous role was playing Kiston in the Doctor Who episode Resurrection of the Daleks.
It is so.
Having initially gone for the role of Pete Beale, Grantham missed out on the part, but soon won over the producers who gave him the role of Den, with both Smith and Holland feeling that he had a tensed-up internal emotion of some sort that was being held in. There was something behind the eyes too, barely contained violence. EastEnders now had a good actor in a strong part right at the core of the show, and they were keen to make the most of it, putting Den up front and centre every opportunity they could. Case in point, take a look at how EastEnders' very first episode opens.
Oh, stinks in here, doesn't it?
The very first thing EastEnders viewers ever saw was Den's foot, and the first line spoken was his. It was a good start. 13 million people tuned in to see that first episode, and the public seemed keen to embrace this new soap, gripped by the gritty kitchen sink element of it, with raw performances and realistic characters. And then, quite dramatically, one of the biggest scandals in soap history broke. Leslie Grantham, that promising new star, was a convicted killer. Grantham's autobiography, Life and Other Times, is, as it is with EastEnders, sparse when it comes to the events of the 3rd of December 1966. As Grantham tells it, he was serving in West Germany as part of his national service, in debt and the victim of some pretty aggressive bullying from his fellow soldiers. In a fairly insane plan to get the money needed to pay off his £27 debt, Grantham took a gun from the armoury, apparently not knowing it was loaded, and went looking for a victim. He thought to rob a businessman, walking alongside the man and chatting with him until he found the right moment to strike, but says he enjoyed his company so much that he found he couldn't go through with it. Opting instead to take a taxi back to his barracks, he asked the driver to stop and let him out, and then decided to go ahead with his plan and pulled the gun on him. When the driver tried to grab the gun from Grantham, it went off and killed him. His name was Felix Rees, and he was 30 years old. The scandal was huge. He was the big star of the BBC's new central soap, having been convicted of murder. It was dynamite for the tabloids. Grantham had already assumed something like this might happen. He'd made the decision to inform Julia Smith when she'd offered him the role of Den, giving her the option to back out and avoid the media frenzy and backlash that was soon to follow.
I suddenly thought, I've got to tell Julia Smith that I come with some baggage. And she said, there for the grace of God go everyone, which I thought was very lovely of her and very understanding.
Smith turned him down and refused to recast the role after Grantham's criminal past was revealed, arguing that it was a, quote, Christian duty to forgive, end quote. After all, Grantham had turned himself in, expressed real remorse and guilt over his actions, and served 10 years in prison for it. For all the press's criticisms, Grantham had paid the penalty for his crime that the law had demanded of him, and it was easy for the BBC to rally support to Grantham's side because of this.
It seemed to me, anyway, because I was involved in all that, quite obvious that, you know, here was a man, whatever he'd done, that he'd served his sentence, and that it shouldn't impinge at all on our attitude towards him.
Even the rest of the cast of EastEnders expressed sympathy for him. When Grantham made it clear that if any of the cast wanted him to go because of this, then he would, he was met with a chorus of colleagues dismissing the matter out of hand.
I'm not very good at public speaking, so I just pinned a note on the board saying, look, if it upsets any of you, then I'm quite happy to walk.
I went straight up to him as soon as I got the letter and said, don't be ridiculous. You've done the deed, you've paid your price, and welcome. That's what I did straight away.
Leslie was our teammate. He was my opposite number in the show, and it was his past. It was over and done.
Though the fact that he'd paid the price made it easy for the BBC to navigate the scandal, it helped that it wasn't really something they could be damaged from. Not only had Grantham been to prison, and so demands that he'd be punished further seemed needlessly excessive, but he was playing a villainous character, so his villainous act hardly clashed with the role he was playing. If anything, it only added to it. What's more, I don't think we should be too quick to write off any sort of pragmatism on the BBC's part either. For all of Julia Smith's talk of forgiveness, she was a hardened and focused television producer. Is it really so much to believe that she heard Grantham's story and was reminded of the old P.T. Barnum quote, "There's no such thing as bad publicity"? After all, a story like this could only serve to generate interest in a soap that the BBC hoped would bolster its chances against ITV. How many people would tune into EastEnders just to see the nationally famous killer of a taxi driver? It's not difficult to see why Den has attained such legendary status. Former EastEnders producer Louise Berridge has compared him to a character in Old Western. Den somehow manages to combine the characteristics of a villainous Lee Van Cleef-style outlaw with those of the sleazy bartender and the pillar of the community mayor type. He's the sort of figure you'd probably want in your community, given how he likes to view himself as being the guy you'd go to if you needed something sorted and had nowhere else to turn. But I don't think he's the sort of man you'd ever warm to if you knew him. Grantham's performance, Den's writing, and the central role of the character led to major storylines coming his way. EastEnders' first great whodunit was based around the mystery identity of the father of 16-year-old Michelle Fowler's baby. Numerous suspects were put forward, but given Den's huge star status, it could only really have been him. Incidentally, it is this moment, the reveal that the 39-year-old Den Watts had gotten his daughter's 16-year-old best friend pregnant, that led to him being nicknamed Dirty Den. The second, and more consequential of Den's great storylines, was broadcast on Christmas Day 1986, and featured Den handing Angie divorce papers after he discovered she'd lied about having only 6 months to live. The couple's tumultuous relationship, bolstered by the obvious chemistry between Leslie Grantham and Anita Dobson, had led the pair to becoming huge stars of the time, with Britain being a nation gripped with so-called Den and Angie mania. We'll talk more about this Christmas Day episode in a future video, but to call it a monumental success seems like an understatement, with the episode being viewed by approximately 30 million people. To put that in perspective, the population of Great Britain at the time was little over 56 million. That's 53% of the country. By 1988, Grantham was looking to leave EastEnders, keen to try other projects and avoid the spectre of typecasting. There were two problems with this. The first is that he was the soap's biggest star. The second is that two of the soap's other biggest stars had exactly the same idea. Angie actress Anita Dobson and Tom Watt, the actor who played lovable oddball Lofty Holloway, were also keen to leave the soap. To lose one main player was bad enough. To lose three was cataclysmic. There were real fears that EastEnders would struggle if all three were to depart at the same time, and so Grantham was convinced to film a mass of scenes set inside prison, where Den had ended up after making an enemy of the criminal organisation known as The Firm. Doing so meant the character remained on the soap for another year. It would be The Firm who were responsible for Den's first exit. Having become something of a liability, The Firm decide that they cannot risk letting Den, who has inside knowledge of their criminal dealings, live, and kidnap him while he's being taken to court. Though Den escapes his kidnappers and quickly plans to flee to Spain, he can't resist meeting with Michelle one final time. Unbeknownst to him, assassins sent by the Firm have tracked him down. And so it ended. Not with a bang, but a splash. Except it didn't. Though this had indeed been conceived by Tony Holland and Julia Smith as a clear-cut death for Den Watts, the BBC were far from rejoicing at the idea. After all, Den was the goose that laid the golden egg, the most popular character in British television, and you don't kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Orders were issued from on high. The script was not to be changed, but the final cut was. The original footage showed Den being hit by the bullet and falling into the canal, looking very dead. The BBC's edit is what we got. We see nothing aside from the gun itself, hear nothing other than the shot being fired and the following splash. That's an awful lot of room in which to wiggle. Smith and Holland were not pleased, quitting over the incident, but the BBC had gotten what they wanted. There was now sufficient doubt in the public's mind over whether Den was actually dead. Sure, he could be, but having been given so little evidence of this, there was just as good a chance that he'd managed to escape. After all, if anyone could get out of seemingly certain death at the hands of the mob, it was Den Watts. Leslie Grantham got to move on to other work. Dirty Den cemented his status as one of British soap's most iconic characters, and the door was left decidedly open for a return should actor and institution wish it. Would that it were that simple. There is a strange little footnote to this part of the Den Watts story that is at odds with so much of the BBC's intent. Writer Tony Jordan joined the EastEnders writing team in 1989, after Den had died. Having been a huge fan of the relationship dynamics of Den and Angie, Jordan was obsessed with the idea of bringing Den back, saying, "I was always a bit miffed that I'd never got to write for Den and Angie. At story conferences I'd say, how do we know he's dead? They never found a body. Eventually, just to shut me up, they made me write an episode where Den's body was found unidentified by his ring." It's an interesting decision by the writing team to seemingly canonise Den's death, and I must confess it struck me as somewhat odd that the BBC would have allowed this, given that it would only serve to put hurdles in the way of a future return. This was before I realised the BBC lightly didn't care. They had cast doubt where it mattered. Nobody was going to remember anything past the scene on the banks of the canal. Nothing else mattered. As it stands, it seems as though Jordan himself was reluctant to fully kill Den off. Yes, a body is found, but Sharon only very reluctantly identifies it as her father. On the one hand, this could be because she doesn't want to admit the truth. On the other, it could be that she wants closure and is willing to accept, however unsure that she is, that the decomposing corpse in front of her is actually her father. The signet ring that Sharon finds in the market is also an interesting little problem. If you look closely at the scene in Den's final episode where he leaves the taxi, you'll notice he's not wearing a signet ring. How then did the ring get into the canal to be found by the boy who sold it to the market stall holder if Den wasn't wearing it? Now, this could very easily be an oversight on Jordan's part. After all, if you need something to identify a person with, a signet ring is a pretty good idea. But it is tantalising to think he went through all that trouble just to keep the door open. It's remarkably fortunate for future writers that, although this little addendum had muddied the waters, it had not done anything to either fully confirm or deny whether Den was alive or dead. and that was the end of it. Den was sort of dead, but not really. Even though we'd had a funeral and a body had been buried, the powers that be had kept the ace up their sleeve. Months turned to years, years turned to a decade.
And some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. History became legend. Legend became myth.
Dirty Den's death became cemented in the general public imagination. Unless you saw his death firsthand, chances are you took it at face value that Den Watts was dead and buried. And then, one night in late September, some 14 years later, Dirty Den walked out of the shadows.
If he was alive, there is nothing in this world that would have kept him from me, nothing.
Den might have fallen into historical legend status for fans, but for decision makers at EastEnders and the BBC at large, he was never far from their thoughts. Accounts vary, and it's hard to really narrow down dates here, but from what Leslie Grantham and various EastEnders producers have said, there had been numerous attempts to get the characters back on the show since 1991, each and every time turned down by Grantham, who either didn't care for the scripts he was presented with, or didn't think Den would return to the square if Sharon wasn't there. As far as reasons go, these two are pretty convincing. I can totally see scripts being written solely for the point of getting the Golden Goose back without fully caring what he'd do once he'd returned, and Letitia Dean had left the show from 1995 to 2001 to pursue other work. Sharon was the single most important person in Den's life. What other reason would there be for him to return to Albert Square if she wasn't there? I think there are some other key reasons for Grantham turning down these offers, namely that he didn't feel a need to return. If you watched my previous video, you'll know that Julie Goodyear's career was not going as brilliantly as perhaps she would have liked after leaving Coronation Street, and that one of the reasons she returned to the soap was likely to regain a sense of career security. Leslie Grantham never really had that need. Granted, he never landed a role as big as Den, but he wasn't exactly going hungry either. He did a fair bit of theatre work and had guest roles in a fair few TV shows, including a number of episodes of The Bill. I'd say the biggest roles Grantham had at this time were the TV game show adaptation of the board game Cluedo, where he, believe it or not, plays a former soldier who served time for murder, much to the disgust of Felix Reese's family, who wrote a letter of complaint. He also had his presenting gig on the game show Fort Boyard. Incidentally, it is this that first introduced me to Grantham as a child. I'm also not sure that the other great potential lure, fame, would have carried very far with Grantham either. Having read his autobiography, I get the impression that Grantham really wasn't that bothered by the fame generated by his biggest role. It came as more of a shock than anything else, and he doesn't seem to care for the press interest that came with it. But he refers to himself as an actor first and foremost. He was there to do a job, and everything else was incidental. I'm not suggesting Grantham's desire for privacy put him off returning, but I certainly don't think he felt much aggrieved by the fact that he was no longer experiencing the massive media interest that he had done throughout his time on the soap. I think it should be said that if Dirty Den had returned within perhaps 5 years of his first departure in 1989, that we wouldn't necessarily have the criticisms about rewriting the past that began to surface in 2003. It's the right length of time, I think, to believe that Den had faked his death and lain low for a while. Fundamentally, EastEnders only has itself to blame for this. We don't know what the nature of these offers throughout those 14 years were. We don't know the storylines proposed. All we know is that Grantham didn't think much of them, and it suggests, to my mind at least, a desire to have Den back for the sake of having him back. Those making the offers weren't prepared to do the work and earn it. 2003 was different though. We know why Grantham returned because we know why he turned down all the previous offers. Sharon was back in Albert Square and the scripts offered were good enough to get him interested. The real question is, what led to the producers making more of a concentrated effort? There are several answers to this question. Firstly, we have to look at where Coronation Street was at this point. Though the beginning of the millennium had heralded one of the soap's weakest points in its history, the tide had changed. New executive producer Kieran Roberts had managed to get the show moving in the right direction again, and much more importantly, had successfully brought Coronation Street into the new age. In 2003, Coronation Street had introduced its first gay character, Todd Grimshaw, played by Bruno Langley, a teenager struggling with his sexuality. We'll talk more about Todd in another video, but suffice to say it was long overdue for Corrie to tackle LGBT issues. EastEnders had featured its first gay kiss in 1985. Brookside made headlines for the first lesbian kiss in 1994. To say that Coronation Street had lagged behind in this regard is an understatement, and though the first gay kiss wouldn't come until October of 2003, the show was known to be moving in that direction. EastEnders wasn't helped by the fact that Coronation Street was enjoying what is arguably the most successful storyline in all of British soap. Richard Hillman absolutely deserves a video in his own right, but his time on the show saw viewing figures peak at 19 million. So what we have in 2003 is a Coronation Street resurgence, a new executive producer who knew what he was doing, a move to embrace modernity that had long been missing, and a hugely successful storyline. The soap's little dark age was well and truly over, and now it was EastEnders who was on the back foot. If ever there was a time to play the ace up the sleeve, it was now. I do think there's more going on here though. The generation who watched EastEnders as kids in the 80s had grown up and taken positions at the head of the soap themselves now. They'd watched Den at exactly the right time to make an impression. These were now the people at the heart of the BBC and EastEnders. I think it would be fair to say that previous offers were made to Leslie Grantham from a largely business perspective. The show needs a boost, let's bring back its greatest icon. In 2003, however, I think the offer came from the heart. That's not to say that before 2003 people weren't eager to work with Grantham or respected the character, but I think the attitude of the people involved was different. Those kids who'd been so captivated by the character in the 80s had grown up and wanted him back in a way that the number-orientated producer who simply saw what Den could do for the show could not. I also think it's worth mentioning that Den's return may have, in part, been inspired by that of Bet Lynch the previous year. I admit it must sound slightly odd to hear. After all, Bet Lynch's return had been a disaster. It had also, however, been a huge story that had brought in viewers. Bet Lynch's return had worked in the short run. It proved, therefore, that there was an appetite to see old characters return, and that it could pay dividends in the short term at least. Give the character a good storyline and who knows what might happen. Bringing Dirty Den back had always been seen as potentially lucrative, and there were aspects of Bet Lynch's return that strongly supported that argument. With all these factors in mind, it seems clear why Leslie Grantham agreed to return to EastEnders. It was, he claims, a return designated to tie in with the show's 20th anniversary. A nice coincidence, no doubt. Grantham met with executive producer Louise Berridge to discuss the possibility of a return. He was tentative. Berridge persuaded him to think about it. The scripts, she said, were excellent. Grantham agreed. Having seen the scripts himself, he found them to be, quote, bloody good, end quote. Grantham's autobiography is a difficult source. He speaks fondly of EastEnders, and yet when it comes to discussing the factors that led to his return, he is frustratingly brief. He dedicates less than 2 pages to the discussion, and about 2.5 to his second stint on the show. The reasons for this, I think, are a reluctance to discuss anything related to the embarrassing scandal that would end everything. The media were abuzz. Fans were engrossed by news that EastEnders' biggest icon was returned to the soap. Grantham's fellow cast and crew members were just as thrilled to have him back, with new stars eager to work with the legendary Dirty Den Watts. In his autobiography, Grantham talks about his first proper day back. My first scene was to be in Angie's den, my only scene of the day. All I had to do was walk out from behind a plant and utter the immortal line,
"Hello, Princess."
I received a round of applause. God knows what would have happened if I stepped out and recited Hamlet's soliloquy. Dirty Den was back. But what was he returning to?
Who's back?
Dennis Watts, Sharon's father.
You're talking about his brown bread.
No, you ain't. Not no more, dear. He's risen.
Den's return was set up in the early months of 2004. Sharon had been back on the square since 2001, and in February of 2004 was joined by Vicky, Michelle Fowler's daughter by Den, Sharon's adoptive half-sister, and wielder of clunky American accent that conveniently disappeared after a few months.
No, you stay right there. Okay, so I went into town. Why didn't I tell you? Because I knew you'd freak. Did I smoke? Did I take drugs? Did I have wild sex? Did I even come back that late? I don't think so, but a paranoid old dragon like you is never going to believe that.
Vicky and Sharon soon tracked down another of Den's children, Dennis, whose mother had been a teenager when she embarked on a short-lived fling with Den. Having been in care and never known his father, Dennis struggles to open up to his new family, but soon he embraces them. Shortly before Den's return, Dennis and Phil embark on a feud, which results in Dennis having to kill gangster and head of the firm, Jack Dalton. But before he dies, Dalton tells Dennis that Den is still alive, though this is not revealed to the audience at this point. Though Sharon is disbelieving of this revelation, Vicky heads to Spain to try and find the father she never knew, and brings him back as a surprise for Sharon. Despite being happy to see the father she thought was dead, Sharon and Den begin to get to know each other again, and Den's return is met with surprise from other residents of the square, though not Phil Mitchell, who brushes off the legendary figure as a washed-up old man. Learning more about Phil, including his relationship with Sharon and current ownership of the Queen Vic, Den plots to bring Phil down, and does so in a robbery designed with the purpose of getting Phil arrested. With Phil in prison, Den tricks his sister, Sam, into signing over the Vic to him. As the family settles into their old home, Den leaves for Spain and returns with his wife, Chrissy, played by Tracy Ann Oberman, who he'd married some years previously, unbeknownst to Sharon. The idyllic family life of the Watts is shattered, though, when Dennis and Sharon announce that they are in love. Den and Vicky are, of course, disgusted, and Den plots to break up his children's relationship by telling Dennis's girlfriend, Zoe Slater, played by Michelle Ryan, to lie to Dennis about being pregnant. In order to give some veracity to the lie, Den very charitably offers to impregnate Zoe himself and sets up a situation whereby Dennis would discover the pair in bed together. With Vicky having left for America, Dennis and Sharon having fled the country to escape Den's judgment, and Chrissy now planning revenge on Den for his infidelity, Den is left alone and unhappy. After speaking with Doc Cotton, Den resolves to get his house in order and restore his ruined family. Returning to the Vic to make amends with Chrissy, Den is instead confronted by his wife, Zoe, and Sam Mitchell, the three women he's wronged most harshly, and after he's tricked into showing his true colours to Sharon, who has been brought back from America for this moment under the pretense that her father is on his deathbed, Den loses his composure and attempts to kill Chrissy, only to be beaten over the head with a doorstop by Zoe. Thinking her husband is dead, Chrissy sits beside his body to have a quiet moment with him, and is shocked when he reveals he's still alive. Panicking, Chrissy takes the doorstop and stoves her husband's head in, finally bringing an end to the life of one of soap's most iconic titans. There's a lot to really like about this storyline. It's pretty clear right from the offset why Grantham wanted to return. The stuff with Sharon is easy to write. It's a painting by numbers reaction. There are certain beats you just need to hit. Her initial reaction is perfect. At first she's shocked, then she's happy that her father is still alive and her childish hope of seeing him again has come true. Then there's the horror of what this realization means and just how overwhelming this moment and Den's deception is, so much so that she has to go and throw up. The dynamic of Sharon's relationship with her father is changed from this point. She's overjoyed that he's back, but terrified he'll leave again without telling her. There's a desire to confront and to criticise, but she can't bring herself to do it in case she pushes him away. The morning after he returns, she wakes up and finds that he's not in her spare room, and her first thought is that he's left again. It's a portrayal of Sharon as the vulnerable child she was in the aftermath of Den's first death, and it's great. Incidentally, I've always really liked that Den refers to Sharon as his princess, because, by extension, it means that Den thinks of himself as the king. It's a nice little insight into the character that I don't think many people note. It's not just Sharon who stands out though. Den's other children have real purpose here. Vicky is probably the least interesting of the three, but her main purpose is to contrast with Sharon. Sharon was around the same age Vicky was when Den was first in EastEnders, and her presence means we get to see just how much Sharon means to her father. Sure, he's fond of Vicky, but it's not a patch on his feelings for Sharon. Den even says as much. But it's Dennis who really shines for me. He's a complex, almost tragic figure, both desperate to be close to Den, the father he never knew, and deeply resentful of him for abandoning him and his mother, leading to an early life in care and riddled with abuse. Actor Nigel Harman does an excellent job of balancing the two emotions, and his slight physical resemblance to Leslie Grantham, along with the tiny character choices about how Dennis carries himself in such a similar way to his father, has contributed to Dennis Rickman remaining a fan favourite character. Den, for his part, lacks a lot of interest in any sort of parental role for either Dennis or Vicky, yet again demonstrating that Sharon really is the only person in Den's life who truly matters. I also really like the feud with Phil. On a purely surface level, it's just nice to see these two big figures clash, and it makes perfect sense in a "this town ain't big enough for the two of us" sort of way. But I really like seeing these two very different personalities interact. There's a Machiavelli quote I'm rather fond of.
A prince must be a fox to spot the snares, and a lion to overwhelm the wolves.
That's the difference between Den and Phil. Den is a pretty skinny guy. He's quite lean and not at all built in the same way as Phil, and so he's not able to go throwing his weight around in the same way. He has to be smarter than that. Phil could physically intimidate or dominate just about everybody on the square, but he's prone to doing rather than thinking. Den, for example, would never have allowed himself to get tricked in the way Phil does in the robbery scene. There's a great moment that demonstrates this view wonderfully. Phil has escaped from prison, albeit with a broken arm, and decided, quite reasonably, to beat the hell out of Den. Phil has no trouble whatsoever getting the upper hand on Den and throwing him around, almost literally with one arm tied behind his back. And then Den does this.
Can't you go a bit easier? I mean, this stuff costs money. Oh, about time you turned up.
Phil would never have thought of doing something like that, and it's the best advantage Den has. There's another little moment like this when Den goes to speak with Dot and finds she's being terrorised by a gang of yobs.
Really in the mood to crack a few heads tonight. And if that's what you want, then bring it on.
Come on, who needs this?
Yeah. Probably give himself a heart attack or something.
That really tells you everything about Den. He knows he could never have taken those kids, but he's cunning enough to make it seem like he could have.
Den will push his luck and chance his arm right until the last minute. And if he sees the other bloke's not going to budge, then Den will laugh and walk away. If he sees the other bloke's fear in his eyes, then Den's got him.
I have to say though, as much as I enjoy Den versus Phil, I echo the sentiments of just about everyone in that I think it's a shame Peggy and Grant weren't also present. After all, Grant and Sharon were married, and he was downright abusive towards her on multiple occasions. Alas, Ross Kemp and Barbara Windsor would not appear on EastEnders until Den had died a second time. It had long been said that there was a certain subtext to Den and Sharon's relationship, that perhaps Den was a little too possessive of his princess, behaving more like a jealous lover than a concerned father. I have to say I see where such readings come from, but EastEnders never leaned into it and never acknowledged it on screen. Den's second outing tips its hat towards those ideas. Sharon falls in love and begins sleeping with Den's biological son, Dennis, who looks and acts an awful lot like him and has his own complicated feelings towards his father, and Den's reaction is one of explosive rage. It's a storyline that flirts around the edges of incest in a way almost designed to give recognition to the spectre that had always been lingering in the background of the Watts family, but never in any way acknowledged. I have to say, it's a nice touch. This theme also plays into Den sleeping with Zoe. Dennis cuckolded Den with Sharon, so now Den is cuckolding Dennis with Zoe. There's lots of other little things to love about Den's return. Chrissy is great, a nice difference to the more passive and tragic Angie. I like seeing an older Den fall into darker and darker places as his family dissolves around him. I like that Den's death comes at the hands of women is scorned. It feels very fitting indeed, and I appreciate how his final meeting with Sharon mimics the moment he returned.
Hello, Princess.
I love the name of Sharon's club, Angie's Den, which works on multiple levels. The surface level of it being both her parents' names and a play on Den, but it's also worth noting that it's a possessive Angie here. It's not Angie and Den, it's Angie's Den, i.e. her mother's idealised version of her father, which has become Sharon's own version of her father. I also have to say I enjoy Den's line when he visits his grave and sees he and Angie have been buried together.
Me and Angie in the same grave.
Oh, ta.
Someone certainly had a sense of humour.
Not only is it touching to see Den express some sadness over Angie's death, but it's a pretty funny line. Not a patch on Ian Beale's at Angie's funeral in 2002, though.
Amen.
I bet her and Den are fighting already.
Though Den's return didn't make a huge change in EastEnders' shifting fortunes, it did provide another layer of defence. The episode in which Den returned received 17 million viewers, a 62% audience share, and though Den's second round on the show was nowhere near as successful as his first, there is a lot to like it. Modern views of Den's return vary. For the most part it has been relegated to a joke, a ridiculous retcon by a show desperate to stem the flow of viewers. Perhaps I'm in a minority here, but I feel pretty warmly towards Den's return. I can absolutely see why Grantham came back. He was given a lot of very juicy things to work with, and EastEnders pulled out all the stops to get him back. We don't talk about that though, do we? When we revisit this chapter in EastEnders history, we don't truly do it to discuss the storylines or the character, or even the behind-the-scenes motives for bringing Den back. When we talk about the return of Dirty Den Watts, we do it to discuss perhaps the most infamous fall from grace ever experienced by a British soap star.
This young lady said to me, why do you do the stupid things that you do? And I say, well, when I was a policeman, it was 99% boredom, 1% terror. I always preferred the 1%.
In May 2004, the Mirror newspaper published details of Leslie Grantham's online affair with a 23-year-old woman who went by Amanda. The details were graphic, to say the least, with the paper even going so far as to publish screenshots. I won't go into too much detail about what was said, but you can probably imagine the sort of discussion that was had given these pictures. It was pretty sordid stuff, not least because most of these web chats happened in his dressing room, with some even happening while Grantham was playing Captain Hook in a pantomime production of Peter Pan, with the actor allegedly performing sex acts while in costume. It wasn't just sex that was discussed. Grantham apparently made a number of disparaging remarks about colleagues and crew on EastEnders. He reportedly branded Jesse Wallace a vile dog, Shane Ritchie big-headed and self-infatuated, Kim Metcalf a block of wood and thick, and Wendy Richard a wanker. He also apparently bragged about his own fame, claiming the rest of the cast were, quote, awestruck by him. No doubt you've already guessed by now, but the good-looking 23-year-old Amanda was not in fact seriously interested in the 57-year-old Grant. It seems pretty clear that this was nothing more than a honey trap right from the get-go, designed to try and get something juicy from a man who'd been sinking deeper and deeper into the murkiest parts of the internet. Ever made a mistake, known it was a mistake, even as you were doing it, and yet you carry on with it regardless? So Grantham begins Sex Lies and the Internet, the 25th chapter of his autobiography, which provides us with the explanation of the scandal that blighted the end of his career. He compares the incident to the desire to touch wet paint to be certain that it's still wet. You know you shouldn't do it, you know what the likely outcome will be, but you just can't help it. As Grantham tells it, he'd fallen into an obsession with the internet as a result of the sheer amount of time he spent as an actor waiting in his dressing room to be called. When I first started out, different actors would kill the time in different ways. They'd do the crossword, they'd answer fan mail, but you can imagine my delight when I stumbled upon this newfound contraption called the internet. You could get a one-page summary of a Harold Pinter play, you could get a potted CV of the commissioning editor you were due to see at Channel 4, and there was, of course, the wet paint element to it as well. You could tap in these 3 letters and a world of boundless, scary, fascinating, hilarious possibilities would open up. Just 3 letters. S-E-X. From there, it was really only a matter of time before Grantham was caught up in something like this. He was actually put in touch with Amanda by another woman he'd been speaking with, a woman who worked in television. It could not have been more obvious that this was a honey trap, and reading that chapter, you are all too aware that Grantham himself knows just how staggeringly foolish he was. Though he was clearly taken advantage of to some extent, I'm not sure he deserves too much sympathy. After all, he was spending an awful lot of time having sexually explicit chats with a woman he believed was more than 30 years his junior, and actively making plans to meet up with her for sex, despite having been married to his wife, with whom he had 3 children, for as long as this woman had been alive. The press, of course, had a field day. The headlines basically wrote themselves, with lots of spins on the name Dirty Den. It was mortifying for Grantham, and worse for his family, who were hounded by reporters. In one instance, a journalist attempted to conduct an impromptu interview with Grantham's son, Daniel, who was 9 years old and had Down syndrome, and Grantham wrote that his other 2 sons were being bullied at school over it. The shame and humiliation became too much to bear. Grantham describes his failed suicide attempts with real humour, but they're clear indicators of a seriously difficult period. He first made an attempt at cutting his wrists with an X-Acto blade, but it snapped. Then he went into the garden and tried to hang himself from a pipe with a skipping rope, but the pipe broke. Undeterred, he tried again from a tree, but was surprised when he simply jumped from his stool and landed on the ground, the elastic skipping rope having stretched. Finally, he resolved to drown himself, wading out to the centre of a pond, wearing a rucksack filled with bricks and dumbbells, but found that whatever he did, he could not make himself sink. Eventually, he decided to just lie back and wait for hypothermia to take its course, but after 2 hours he got fed up and went back home. The end result was inevitable, but there are differing accounts as to exactly what went down. Grantham presented 2 differing versions. In one, he was always meant to leave when he did. Den's second and final death conceived to tie in with the show's 20th anniversary. In another, he decided to leave after the new producer, Kathleen Hutchinson, resolved to move the show and Den's character in a darker direction to stem bleeding viewing figures. The other explanation is that Grantham's scandal proved too difficult for the BBC to handle, and that he was fired. Tony Jordan discussed his view on the matter in a 2006 interview. If that Captain Hook stuff hadn't come out, I think it would have worked, and he'd still be in the show. When I saw him on screen after those revelations came out, suddenly I couldn't believe in the character anymore. After that I saw him as Leslie Grantham, not Den Watts. He was older and flawed in all the wrong ways. I think a lot of viewers felt the same, and in the cast as well, probably. For what it's worth, I, along with many others I suspect, lean heavily towards the idea that Grantham was fired. The lack of detail in his autobiography about his departure reads as a man trying to hand-wave things away. The humiliation, one assumes, must have been too great. Here was the show's greatest icon being sacked for a very public and very sordid sex scandal. It's worth noting that I don't believe the sex scandal was the biggest problem here. It's true that it was highly damaging, but I think he might have been able to weather it had the BBC thrown their weight behind him and highlighted the obvious entrapment. I think the real coup de grace came from the comments he made. It's worth examining just who Grantham was reported to have insulted. Jesse Wallace and Shane Ritchie had been hugely successful as Cat Slater and Alfie Moon respectively, fan-favourite characters whose relationship was a huge story for the soap at the time, and Jesse Wallace was an especially big name. Kim Metcalf might have only been on the soap for 2 years, replacing Daniela Westbrook as Sam Mitchell in 2002, but she too had proved popular, and Wendy Richards had played Pauline Fowler since the show's inception, having been one of the original cast members, and had enjoyed a successful career with the BBC prior to EastEnders, with her role as Shirley Brahms in Are You Being Served? These were not junior players, these were big stars, especially Wallace and Richards, with Grantham also reportedly bad-mouthing the quality of the scripts and embarrassing the BBC in general with his antics. He'd alienated just about everybody with the power to back him. I dare say a lot of the pressure to sack Grantham came from these members of the cast, a sentiment Jordan seems inclined to agree with. Being actors, their reaction would have been, well, I can forgive him for murdering someone, but then he said he didn't like me, bastard. It's tempting to criticise the BBC for sacking Grantham for his 2004 scandal, but embracing him in 1986 despite his murder conviction. I don't think the comparison is a fair one. It was easier for the show to defend a man who'd killed accidentally and served his time than it was for them to defend a man in a sleazy scandal that had only just erupted and featured him slagging off multiple co-workers. It doesn't help that the BBC could, in purely pragmatic terms, benefit from the publicity generated by Grantham's conviction. I dare say even the most accomplished PR guru would struggle to find a way to turn wanking on webcam while dressed as Captain Hook to their advantage.
But it doesn't serve my interests. How does it serve my interests?
After leaving EastEnders, Grantham moved to Bulgaria and continued to work. His marriage lasted another 9 years but collapsed in 2013. Though he initially had nothing but positive words to say about EastEnders, he soon began to express disdain for the direction the show had taken, calling it far-fetched and unrealistic. In 2018 he was diagnosed with lung cancer and died aged 71. It's difficult to discuss Leslie Grantham's legacy. On the one hand, he was the greatest icon EastEnders has ever had, a talented actor whose performance earned his character an almost legendary status, and saw him at the heart of two of the biggest storylines in British soap history. On the other hand, he is a figure marred by scandal and controversy. After he died, it was revealed that a credible allegation had been passed to police in 2012 as part of Operation Yewtree, with Grantham being accused of sexually abusing a schoolgirl. The investigation was dropped after the accusers decided not to pursue it. I make no attempt to salvage Grantham's reputation or to defend his character. I won't argue that his talent and legacy have been unfairly stained, or that he is overdue some sort of reappraisal. The reaction from EastEnders after he died was surprisingly muted. Even today, it seems as though he's not discussed as often as perhaps you'd imagine him to be. There were no special tribute programmes or falling tributes from colleagues. It's fitting, I suppose, that Leslie Grantham's time in EastEnders ended the way it began, with scandal and with controversy. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to give it a like and subscribe to this channel for more soap content. I also have a Patreon, so if you want to make a small donation, it would really help this channel to grow. There's lots of rewards available, including voting on future videos, as well as little supplemental essays on each month's topic, and any donation would be hugely appreciated. Links to my Patreon and Twitter can be found in this video's description, along with links to scenes and clips from this video's topic, and I highly encourage you to check those out. Thanks, bye.